Does anybody do an intro, or do we just kick off?
Just kick off.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. We're sticking here till the bitter end. I guess we got the last spot, so they always say save the best until last, and hopefully we don't disappoint.
Right.
So just by way of introduction, my name is Simon Hickling. I'm the VP of Business Development for Phlow Corporation. Phlow is an organization founded in 2020 to address some of the shortages of essential medicines in the US. We were founded when COVID took off, and there were companies in India and Italy in particular who were not exporting APIs anymore for essential medicines, and it was noted there was a shortage. The US government stepped in and gave our organization some funding to build a facility in Virginia. That facility now, 5 years later, is up and running. We have R&D facilities doing route of synthesis work. We have kilo labs, and we have a large-scale multi-ton facility. The premise of Phlow is really to create the future of how medicines are made in America. And in order to make some of these essential medicines be cost competitive, particularly with Indian and Chinese manufacture, we're looking at advanced chemistries such as continuous flow chemistry. So I'm here today with Joe to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in that space, give you an idea of what's going on in continuous flow chemistry, where and how it can be utilized, and address any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Simon. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last session today. There might be one similar around the corner. Anyway, we're speaking here about flow chemistry, specifically some of the ways that flow chemistry has started, how it's evolved, and what are the future opportunities for flow chemistry. As I said, my name is Joe Armstrong. I'm currently Chief Marketing Officer for TCG GreenChem. We initially initiated our company about 7 years ago. We were a small company at the time called GreenChem, and then we changed our name to TCG GreenChem when we got our Indian investors in October 2019. Our facility is now located in Princeton, New Jersey. It's about a 54,000 square foot facility, and the main two things that we drive in our company is use of catalysis, not only the synthesis, the new invention of new catalysis screen, etc. And the right-hand part of what we do is continuous flow chemistry. Our flow chemistry has been in existence for a period of time with my previous career, and also with the CEO of the company, Crescent and Alka. What we're going to talk about today is really around how Phlow really kind of started, but more importantly, what's really driving the change for flow chemistry today. And a lot of it is initially has been batch and going to flow, but there's been some real updates, specifically we'll talk about a little bit about the equipment first, on how that's given to a different opportunity for flow chemistry for others. So one of the big reactor technologies that has occurred is Corning's low flow reactor system, number 2. It came out in 2025. This has a new heart cell glass fluidic module. It improved the heat exchange. Also has multi-zone temperature controls, which are really important. It has an inert gas operation, and it has pulseless dosing and touchscreen analytics. The advantage of that system really has to do with you can use many more different types of combinations to do that chemistry. It's more modular, so you can scale really selectively, and you can go to do R&D and then move directly into scalable processes. The other thing we just want to spoke a little bit on is the 3D printer reactor cells. This is something that's been forward for the last couple of years. It's really starting to get more of a head steam up. There's two main producers, D. Dietrich and Alice Field. These reactors, the one thing that's critical about them, they can be designed with AI. One of the things that you'll see more in continuous flow is using artificial intelligence, not only to design reactors, but how to control the reactors, and also the different pumps that are going to be using, the different flow settings, the temperatures that can be used, and that's going to cycle through different scenarios that's going to really lead to machine learning. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the other online activities or opportunities for flow based on different techniques and et cetera. So do you want to mention some of the different technologies
Yeah,
Simon?
so there's a number of technological trends emerging in Phlow as well. So Phlow has been utilized for decades, really, when it comes to certainly petrochemical industry, other chemical industries. In the pharmaceutical world, Phlow has been less employed. You're probably going back 15, 20 years when Phlow started to come in. It's still being carried out, but a little bit under the radar by some folks, and there have been some questions about when to utilize Phlow, what kind of reactions, where are advantages coming, how is it scaled up, how is it going to be treated from a regulatory perspective. A lot of those questions have actually been answered, but being as the industry is looking toward FDA guidance, what is actually going to happen when these programs are scaled, there are certainly a few open questions there, and these are the issues that companies like TCG, like ourselves, like some of the other leaders in the industry are answering. When it comes into some of the emerging technological trends, though, we can certainly carry out, I'd say, some traditional chemistries and move them from batch to Phlow. In doing that, a lot of these chemistries are either exothermic or hazardous to handle. It reduces the footprint. It brings in higher throughput, cost savings, savings in waste. So there are some very good reasons to use Phlow. The traditional reactor types, though, have been typically really tubes. So tubes which are held together by pumps. There's been control of that system. But as we start looking at some of the emerging trends, we're starting to see different kinds of reactors, high throughput and automated platforms now coming into play. These high throughput platforms start up in the lab. You can generate a lot of different parameters there, look at a lot of different reaction types, and then really start to look a little bit more deeply into how and why Phlow is working. This goes into the trend Joe mentioned earlier about artificial intelligence and machine learning. As you build this data set, you can then get a good understanding of how certain reactions perform in Phlow, utilize that feedback network, and really learn. So as you're developing new processes, you have a faster path to developing a process which is going to work and work well. That's probably one of the latest trends that we are seeing.
Joe, I was going to highlight one of the other types of technologies that's come out is it's called the continuous oscillatory baffled reactors. These are kind of replacing plug flow reactors. One of the things about plug flow reactors, they've been really held to scale. One of the critical things about it is that behavior, especially if you're going to do a gas and liquid, if you're doing like an ozonolysis. We've done a number of these plug flow reactors with ozonolysis. We can do those on very small scale, but using these continuous oscillatory baffled reactors, they work very well, and they do controlled mixing eddies. So the way these baffles work in the tube, it allows these eddies to be set up so it's really sufficient and very efficient mixing, but it doesn't separate. It keeps the phases separate, and it doesn't mix them together so that you can do the plug flow reactor. And also these reactors with these baffles, there's a good chance that it will be less waste than the older CSTR systems, and they've already shown that they can be higher yields based on the types of eddy mixing that you can occur with these. So moving back into what Simon said, highlighted, is around the technology trends. One of the biggest things you're going to see in Phlow is electrochemistry and photochemistry. Ourselves at TCG GreenChem, we've already done some of the work in photochemistry. One of the things that was limiting photochemistry is really when you have a photoreactor, a lot of times it's creating quite a bit of heat. Even though they're low voltage, these things can create heat. And so making sure you can minimize, keep the temperature controlled, or minimize the temperature has been a little bit of a challenge. But a lot of these new reactors now has much less energy to be able to give you the same wavelength and the same amount of intensity. So that's one advance that's happened in that regard. The other thing that's really going on is electrochemistry. One of the things that's been challenging about electrochemistry is the fine tuning of the electrical current that goes into the Phlow reactor and have that go consistently across the flow. And that's some of the things that some of the new reactors are able to take on, and some of the new generation of electrochemistry, it can be monitored such that you have a more specific amount of electrical flow into the system, and it gives you better consistency, so you don't have an over cathode or over a reactor of an anode, so you can have that much more consistently throughout the reactor itself. Anything you want to mention around the some of the microfluidic systems, Simon?
Yeah, some of the latest systems are based on microfluidic, so very high throughput systems. At this point in time, these are more geared towards, I'd say, drug discovery and high throughput and small quantities, rather than geared towards process chemistry and scale up. Neither of us have really dug into that because our primary aims in our organizations are to scale up, but there are certainly some exciting advances here, and these could well start coming through into production in the next few years. Probably another area that is interesting and growing as well are contiguous flow chemistry steps. So, I think there was almost a panacea being seen of running complete processes in flow. It's a little bit of a misnomer, I think, because flow is really a tool. Certain reactions are going to work well in flow, others are not going to work well in flow. If you're doing a multi-step reaction, then you only want to run a multi-step reaction if it makes sense to do so. At Phlow Corporation, our company, we have got a 4-step contiguous flow reaction followed by an isolation, which has been validated, and we've have a DMF for right now. We'll be publishing a white paper on that imminently, so that's something to look out for. But this can be done within Phlow, but it really is a selection of the chemistry. Does it make sense? Does it make sense from a technology perspective, from an economic perspective? But I think this is definitely one of the growing trends that we are seeing in the technology.
So one thing's around the minute flow type of conditions. You have what's called a digital and droplet microfluidics. So these microfluidic systems, again, they're manipulated by certain electrodes to create these immiscible phases. And these immiscible phases, again, allow chemistry to react basically at the surface of the two phases. These type of microfluidics, they're very programmable, and they have ultra high throughput chemistry. So one of the things that we mentioned before, a lot of these really microfluidic systems have been used more for discovery chemistry. And they've been doing a lot of that discovery chemistry in multi-parallel scenarios. So in that type of chemistry, you do use less amount of reagent use. It does boost the efficiency of these systems based on the surface area, and allows experiments that were impossible in other type of older continuous systems. So you are seeing quite a bit in advance, not only in some of the apparatus of the flow themselves, how you integrate the flow chemistry, those surface areas and those tensions that can be coordinated to have increased flow efficiency and productivity, and a minimum of the solvent. One of the things that's been a big holdback in flow is the amount of solvent that's used. So anything you can do with the efficiency of the chemistry, where you can actually slow the flow, if you will, of the chemistry, will really impact minimization of waste, but still give you opportunity for increased yields.
Yeah, and Joe mentioned earlier the 3D printing of flow reactors. That is something that has really helped to speed up some of the early research. The AI can be used as part of the design process here. There's a lot of flexibility around the design. It lowers the cost of getting into manufacturing. This is used predominantly in R&D right now and for non-GMP production, but as you then go forward into GMP production, you can take that design, build it into a system which can then be validated. But 3D printing is really lowering the barriers to entry for bespoke systems for your particular reaction of interest. And I think as well, one of the advances that we're seeing as an emerging technology here is the production of peptides and peptide synthesis in flow. There's been a lot of talk about GLP-1s and peptides at the event this week. Obviously a huge industry effort now to move forward, and a lot of revenue is being generated. Peptides are currently either typically fermented or produced using solid state peptide synthesis. Very inefficient and expensive processes are utilized there, but there are companies now. There's a company which has announced Peptosystems out of Sweden, who has a public collaboration with Corden, talking about doing a continuous peptide production. So they build the peptide in a continuous system, they isolate in a continuous system, and the cycle times can be reduced by up to 90% there, waste reduced by 40%, and when this technology is up and running, that can give some significant savings for peptide production. So this is really, I think, one of the latest advances we're seeing, which is going to be of great utility in the very near future.
So it might be worth just pausing. We've gone through a period of time, kind of giving you some attributes, specifically around different reactor types, different opportunities with electrochemistry, photochemistry. We can talk a little more about the PAT, the process analytic technology. What I want to do is just pause for a moment. And are there any specific questions that the audience would like to ask before we continue some of our prepared remarks? So any questions from the audience at this time? Yes, go ahead.
So just thanks. So when as you know, I talk to folks, and certainly even within my own experience, there's always a concern of you know, when you get into flow, and if you have a batch process that's, say, early in clinic, because it wasn't worth the investment to develop a flow process, because who knows where it's going or whatever, and then maybe you switch to flow, you know, then the question is, well, my impurity profile going to be different, and so what's that going to be? Is that going to cause more time as I'm trying to get to my, you know, process validation, phase 3 material, and launch? And so can you talk a little bit about what you've seen is something like, in general, batch processes converted to flow processes, and then how big an issue would you know, sort of a different impurity profile or something new came up that you never saw before and was never qualified in early talks and that kind of stuff?
So I'll take a stab at it first, and then I'll hand it over to Simon. So these are actually great questions. These are the questions that everyone asks, specifically, when do you use flow, when do you not flow? Is it really based on scalability or not? One of the things that we've seen in our organization is when a batch process comes into us, the first thing we look at is kinetics of the chemistry. Is it going to be viable from a flow process? Is there a certain issue with hazardous materials? Like one example I'll give in a moment is around cyanation chemistry. Obviously with nitration chemistries, things are really low temperature reactions. These are very beneficial to flow. And the other aspect is something going to be somewhat explosive. So not only a hazardous reaction or a chemical like cyanation, but something that would give rise, if using like trimethyl aluminum, and you need to quench that as the chemistry goes, you have to do a controlled quenching of that. So you don't want to have it obviously all in the vessel at one time, because that can lead to a very exothermic and very deleterious reaction. So being able to meter those in are very important for flow, and great examples. What we've seen actually is flow chemistry can be used for the very first deliveries. So there are a number of processes that have come to us that were batch. And very quickly, we can go from a batch to a prototypical flow in about 2 weeks. That's because of a piece of kit that we use called the VaporTech R series. Now that piece of kit is very similar in that it has a little bit of, I wouldn't really call machine learning, but expertise in how to modify the pump. It has different reactor sets that you can put in there. They can be in tandem, or they can be by themselves. They can be cooled reactors. They can be heated reactors. You can change the length of the tubing to affect the residence time. Also, you have different types of pumps. You have HPLC pumps. You have peristaltic pumps. So depending on if you're going to form a slurry, a peristaltic pump is the type of pump that you want to use. If it's not going to be a slurry, you can use an HPLC pump. And that will allow you to move the material quickly without having to worry about clogging. So if we're going from a batch process to a prototype flow in about 2 weeks, that gives you the opportunity to assess that chemistry. Is it even going to be able to be viable in flow? And we've been very fortunate to take a number of those processes and directly translate them into the Kilo Lab. And we use a lot of computer software tools, like ComSol is one of the key computer software tools that we use as we scale that chemistry, understanding the type of not the baffles, but the type of reactors that's within the cell wall to make sure you're getting the proper mixing, so type of mixers, static mixers, and et cetera, what's going to be the proper ones. And then once you go to the Kilo Lab, we've been very efficient in that. And that kind of chemistry, we've gone up to in about 2 weeks to 6 weeks, we can process about 20 kilos. If you want to just do 1 kilo to 2 to 5 kilos, that can happen really quickly, especially to one of these modular type systems. If you understand the components of the system, like the VaporTech R series, it's very simple then to get the pumps that you need, whether it's peristaltic or HPLC pump, and then you can go to the director tube in tube, another type of reactors. We've used many CSTRs to do that type of chemistry, so you can make that very quickly for the 1 kilo. Around impurity profile, as you scale that, we've had great success, and I think it's across the industry really for flow chemistry. To scale that, it's really a matter of using the computer modeling and et cetera, and our impurity profile has remained very consistent. Class of reactions in particular are very low temperature reactions where you're going to use a metal halogen exchange or some type of lithiation. As you know, just going from a 5 gram to a 30 gram scale reactant, you really get tremendous amount of irreproducibility, specifically low yield and reduced material from that lithium metal exchange reaction. Whereas if you do it in flow chemistry, you can maintain that temperature at very low temperature, minus 75 degrees, continue the reactivity of adding those additions at the appropriate time, and then you can still hit the trademark of the impurity profile, obviating that reduced product and getting to the pure compound. So going into the next stage, you're going from phase 2 to phase 3, that's where it becomes a little more complicated. So we have had an example where we took a cyanation chemistry, and we've been able to scale that now. We initially did it on a kilo, then a few kilos in our kilo lab, and we just transferred that for a 1/4 metric ton. So doing a 1/4 metric ton of material, the biggest challenge we had was developing the new reactor. Actually, we had to fabricate the reactor that we needed specifically for that chemistry. So that becomes a little more entailed. So as you go from phase 1 to phase 2, it's really not that big of a difference, but going from phase 2 to phase 3 and then beyond can be very challenging. One of the things that's still an open question for flow chemistry is really the final flow process that can be API, that can be under really regulatory constraint in a regulatory window. So let me just pause there for a moment and come back to you about the regulatory aspects of the final process, Simon. But does that answer your question going from phase 1 to 2 and then moving into the phase 3 scenario?
Well, my question was really going from batch to, so you've made early clinical material in batch and then decided later. So I can certainly understand if you start flow all the way.
Yeah.
My guess would be probably do better at keeping your purity profile the same because you're scaling out instead of scaling up.
Yeah.
Right. But if you're going from a batch process, say, because then it's later you decide that flow's the way to go because the volumes are much larger than you thought. Or whatever. That's the difference. I was really thinking not so much scaling up of the process that was originally. And so if you had experience where somebody came to you with a batch process and then wanted to switch it to flow sort of at a later stage, how different was the purity profile in general? I mean, I don't know if you have much experience with that.
So we've done a couple examples that I guess I wasn't clear. So many processes that do come to us, actually every process that comes to us is batch, right? And so looking at that chemistry, even if they made a phase 1 campaign of that material, looking at that chemistry that's batch, we can then look if it's going to be flow. Just because someone wants to turn it into flow as you go into larger materials or volumes rather, is not necessarily the reason to do flow. The key reason to do flow, again, is kind of the attributes that we just kind of alluded to. One is, obviously, is its hazardous chemistry, hazardous reagents, if it's temperature, if it has something to do where you have a really highly kinetic reaction. So kinetics plays a big part in when to utilize flow. But if you're looking at different, pour and mixed chemistries, it really depends on what would be advantageous. If it turns out that there's a specific impurity because of a temperature issue or a stoichiometry issue and something in that regard, a lot of times you can obviate those types of impurities based on the flow process. But it really goes to the specific chemistry that's utilized. But as I mentioned, all the chemistry that we get initially is batch, and we convert it to flow. And as I had mentioned, one of the chemistries that we scaled to flow cyanation, it was done in a batch cyanation in about 40 kilos. And then we transfer that to a quarter metric ton in flow chemistry. So do you have other specific examples, Simon, where you had a batch process that then scaled to flow?
Yeah, within our organization, we've been starting really from the start with radiosynthesis and building flow into that radiosynthesis. So it's, as Joe mentions, then it scales up, it's very reproducible. Probably to your point there, if you're coming in at, you're in phase 2 already, you're looking towards phase 3 in validation, there's advantage to flow. Because of the potential to control some of these impurities, there would likely be a change in impurity profile. That is then going to become a question of what do the economics look like? What are the benefits of moving into flow? Do you want to use flow versus batch? Does your regulatory strategy take the impurity profile change into account? So I'd say that probably the 3 major areas to get into flow are going to be that, into phase 1 for phase 1, phase 2, during the phase 2, phase 3 transition where some work can be carried out there, and then as a second generation post-launch route as well. But I could definitely foresee that there would be an impurity profile change in many cases here.
And just a couple examples we've had that were commercial products that we've come into our laboratories. We revamped those chemistries and then made those flow processes. One of the things that you do have the advantage of flow, you can have real on-time monitoring. So we do a lot of reactor IR, that's in-line monitoring. There's other opportunities. There's some HPLC scenarios that you can now do continuously, and there's some other things that are being considered. But for reactor IR and obviously temperature, the easiest ones to maintain and to highlight at flow, to really understand and interrogate those chemistries that you do. So that can give us a real understanding, is something going off the tracks as far as a new impurity or something in that regard. Yes.
Joe, I just had a question on the commercial. So you're working like on the Gen 2 process, right, to convert it to flow. And I had an experience with a former organization I was with where we had that scenario come to us for a crystallization process. And we were actually, and it was a blockbuster. And VP of chemistry wanted it to see if we could do it. It was completely amenable. We actually essentially designed a plant in a hood sort of footprint, which could meet the commercial demands annually. But at the end, it was shut down for regulatory and commercial reasons. Because at the end of the day, they came back and said, so you want us to refile in every jurisdiction? And it just didn't make sense at the end of the day, even though it was perfect for flow. And I'm just wondering what your experience has been there, where the science might be there, but the business case isn't.
Yeah, I mean, Simon, you can maybe speak to that in one of the examples we talked about earlier.
We've come across that, not at that scale, Steve, but we've come across that issue before where we've done very good proof of concept work, which has been scalable and looked like it would be a perfect scientific fit, but the business case just didn't fit it. So, that happens. That happens with really any development work that we would do in any aspect of process chemistry. So, a little unfortunate when that does happen, but it certainly happens.
And we haven't really had an example in that regard, going from looking at the chemistry, how it would change, and then moving into a later stage filing, or are you going to refile that another facility?
I think from a CDMO perspective in general, that's where keeping that dialogue open with the customer really comes in. How does this fit with your filing strategy? How can we work with you as we're going through the process, as we're doing the updates and looking at how things are going? Does this fit? And really, from a CDMO perspective, that's what we're there to do. We're almost the testing ground for some of these new technologies. Companies can come to us and we can try these projects out. If it works, that's what we're all aiming to do, but if it doesn't fit, that's another point of learning for the company we're working with. It's a point of learning for us, and it helps really grow the breadth of knowledge in this space.
Yeah, and we can address this separately later, but I'd also be the question around CDMO capability capacity to host a commercial flow process.
Yeah.
Again, my experience was the crystallization, where a lot of it wasn't necessarily there, and companies were dealing with actually having to put their own kit
Yeah.
at the CDMO to have the work done, because the CDMO just didn't have the infrastructure. It's the batch infrastructure is
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that that's often the case as well. So scale up is definitely a challenge. In certain cases, if it's more modular equipment, you are able to essentially number up rather than rebuild. In other cases, it'll be around building a dedicated skid for that particular process. And again, then the economic considerations come in, the regulatory considerations come in. For the Phlow product I mentioned earlier, which has 4 contiguous flow steps, we had to build a particular piece of kit there. That was done in conjunction with our partners at SK, and that kit is now up and running and validated, but that was a bespoke piece of kit that we did put together there.
Yes.
Again, similar topic there is, I was curious about the customer persona. Who's a typical customer that comes to you? Is it major pharma or biotech? Because it still sounds like it's a last resort going to Phlow, right? And imagine going to a batch CDMO and you're telling him, oh yes, I can run your whatever, steps there, but I need to build the reactor. Obviously, there's such a huge offering in that space that nobody would agree with that. But
Yeah.
how far are we from the, I would say, a mature market offering where there's no resistance by the customer, and who right now are the early adopters that go there? Is it last resort or not?
Well, there's been a number of large CMO that's really taken on Phlow as a key part of what they've done from a manufacturing perspective. But again, what's happened in the last 5 years, a lot of these Phlow processes, the reactors, have become more bespoke. So some of the things you can buy off the shelf. So one of the biggest challenges of Phlow in the beginning were the pumps. So now the pumps are much more sophisticated. They're much larger pumps. They do the metering that's more efficient. So it's very consistent in the amount of reagents, whatever you're mixing together. Also, these new static mixers. I just highlighted also obviously the new oscillatory baffled reactors. Those are new types of reactors that gives you really an example of like doing plug flow chemistry versus what had been done in the past. So the equipment is becoming more bespoke. The equipment is also more standardized. And a lot of these tube-in-tube reactors are really off-the-shelf reactors. It's just a matter of really understanding the flow and the residence time that you're going to need and to do that type of chemistry. And as far as cooling and heating, those are very easy to use with tube-in-tube reactors because the outside tube is maintaining the temperature of the reactants themselves inside the inner tube. So there's many scenarios that's come out in the last few years that these components are more bespoke, and therefore you can put them together basically what your reactor design needs to be and what the chemistry needs to be based on the chemistries, the fluidic properties of the reagents and etc. That mixer, and then initially the residence time for making these compounds.
But that's still very technical, right? So there's still the regulatory, there's still the capacity again, and there's still redundancy, like you build something in-house, and then you have you need another supply in another continent for redundancy. Isn't that being an issue as well? How far are we from that flow?
Well, just briefly, I mean, it takes an expertise in flow. So for example, it's not like you're just going to buy a flow reactor and all of a sudden you're going to start using it. You have to understand the components that go together. So I guess to your question, is this something that's going to be, you plug in and you turn it on? We're not at that stage yet because there's so many different variables that you have to put into flow. But to have the equipment that you can use pretty quickly is pretty simple. So your question is specifically around how easy can it be for someone that's a typical batch company to make flow, or you're talking about designing the chemistry, or?
Well, when you're buying APIs, you need sometimes multiple suppliers for redundancy, and
Yeah.
this seems very, very custom-made, tailored for your API
Yeah.
at one site by one team with one set of equipment. So let's say here in the U.S., but I need a supply
Yeah.
in Europe.
Yeah.
How do we orchestrate? How do I, as a customer, have
Yeah.
a supply on two continents
Yeah.
when I come to you in batch and try to? I'm just trying to build a business.
No, I think that's so. No, I think I understand your point really clear now. Yeah, it's not just one type of flow. Like a reactor is a 4,000 liter reactor, and you have this you have these controls for it, which is very it's very templated across the industry and across the companies and etc. Yeah, that doesn't really specifically exist just for a flow chemistry. Each one, to your point, is more unique for that particular chemistry. There's parts of those flow chemistry of the apparatus that you can reuse for different types of chemistries. From a GMP perspective, typically not, because to clean these reactors and reuse them for other components, that's more of a challenge versus like a batch reactor, that's more commonplace, obviously. So I think to your point, if you're going from one CDMO and we're going to transfer that compound to another CDMO that's a flow process, that's going to be more challenging. And I think that's going to be either going to have to recapitulate it in some regard, or you're going to have to be able to take that flow process and then retool that for the specific site where the reactant is going to be, because you're not going to have the same infrastructure and the components that you would have the other CDMO. So I think it's not transferable as easy as a batch process for sure at this time.
Be a solution to that with scalable, standardized solutions, or?
Yeah, I think that would be one opportunity from that perspective.
Yeah.
Just mentioned something about cleaning and reusing.
Yeah.
You're saying, well, batch reactor, we do batch reactors all the time. It's a very standardized process. Boil it out, take some salt, strip it down, that's great. Why do you think it's harder to do it with flow? I mean, you've got a much smaller surface area, a bit more solid to it, clean it all out. If you want to have a standardized flow reactor or pump, there aren't problems with count pumps on a large scale. So why, this has come up a couple of times in talks that I've heard over the years.
Mhm.
Why do you think it's harder to clean and verify flow?
So go ahead,
Yeah.
Simon. I know that you've got some of these processes
Yeah.
that you're looking at in that regard.
Yeah, so Matt, it's not so much the cleaning itself that's a problem, and the validation for cleaning. That can be done easily. It's more that the configuration of the actual tube system, the pumps, the way everything's put together for a particular reaction could well change. So you're not utilizing one reactor for multiple reactions. You could potentially do that depending upon what reactions you're looking at, but you may have built, particularly when you get to commercial scale, you may have built a reactor to be optimal for that particular process. And then that reactor can't necessarily then be cleaned out and used for another process because it'll be suboptimal for another process. And you could argue that's similar in batch as well, but there's a lot more direct influence of the equipment on the reaction in flow than you would typically see in batch.
You're talking about like a bespoke, customized reactor on a skid.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, let's say, flow cells, pumps. Okay, we built the skid. It's the same thing in plant. Engineers type the various reactors together
Yeah.
based on requirements, what they have available. It's the same thing, we would all pump as a pump.
So
A flow reactor, if it's a pouring as a flow reactor, you can tear that flow reactor back off and re-plumb it, obviously. So
No.
what a lot of people are saying is, well, we just build this as a dedicated flow-out process.
Mhm.
Whereas I'm kind of looking at this saying, I don't see any reason why we take some of these different pieces, clean them all out.
yeah, I'd have to defer to our regulatory people to give you a proper answer there. My take on this, which may or may not be 100% accurate, is if you are then disassembling that equipment and reassembling it, you're then going to have to do some level of requalification for that equipment before you run the next batch. So from a time and economic perspective, it's almost easier to build that dedicated skid and then reuse that dedicated skid. But I definitely want to bring our regulatory people into a conversation like that.
And I know my previous company, Merck and Company, they'll build the skid with all the components, and they leave that particular process. They typically don't break that apart and build another component for a different reaction. So to your point, what are the real reasons for that? One of them could be cost. It's not that hard to build some of these skids and et cetera for that particular component. And to the point of regulatory, to the opportunity of regulatory assessment, I think that's something we'd have to more take offline. So I can't really answer the question from that perspective. Yes.
So I was at Sanofi until about a year ago.
Okay.
When I separated. So Sanofi's taken an approach of basically building modular
Well, I haven't interacted with medicinal chemists in quite some time, but one thing I will tell you about medicinal chemists is the tried and true are things they like to do very quickly so they can make the molecules that they want to make. A lot of things, technology they've taken up very quickly has been a new catalytic reactions, new ligands that you can purchase and things like that. So things that are very simple to purchase and implement in chemistry, they'll do. A photoreactor, though, for some of those scientists, it's not a basic photoreactor that you can just buy and implement on small scale. There's some that exist, but then to really look at all the different type of chemistries they want to do, I haven't seen a lot of people do photo redox chemistry, for example, to make many, many different types of molecules. I think it's the opportunity, and maybe they've done that in the last 5 years or so, but I haven't been as close to medicinal chemistry in that regard. But I know that was one of the touts of what flow chemistry could do, is access molecules that you couldn't access before. And not only in photo redox, but now what we're seeing in electrochemistry, those kind of things are going to be much more amenable to flow. But I don't know, have you learned more about the diversity of molecules being made because of you can do it with flow chemistry, like a photo redox to be scaled in flow?
Not really. The programs we've been working on have either been to a particular molecule that's already existent, particularly for the government work that Phlow has done, or with our commercial work, it has been more to bring more efficiency into an existing molecule as well. So, yeah, we're not fundamentally doing any of the design of new molecules from our CDMO perspective.
And there has been, in my previous experience, there was one chemistry that you can only do it by a photo redox chemistry, and that kind of speaks to your point, and that's how we're able to make that one molecule by photo redox, and we couldn't remake it a different way. Go ahead. Yes, another question?
You had the mic for a while, I guess, and give it back.
Help.
Can I just jump back to Mark's point earlier? So you mentioned people coming as a last resort. We have found quite a few people are coming as a last resort to Phlow. And that obviously can then present some issues because it's not necessarily a good approach for Phlow. We've got a very recent example of this where someone came as a last resort. It was not a good fit for flow chemistry. The R&D team then looked at some alternate chemistries which could be employed instead, and we're moving forward on an alternate. I think it's fair to say, though, that Flow's getting more exposure now at OPRD and Gordon conferences, and we're having folks coming more proactively now saying, okay, this looks like it could be a good fit for Phlow. Can you work on this project? Phlow Corp, our name is sometimes a little bit misunderstood. People seem to think we do everything in Phlow, which is certainly not the case. We're using Phlow as that tool. If it's a great fit for the chemistry and the process, we'll use it. If it isn't, we'll look at more traditional process chemistry routes.
We're almost...
Batch processes as well. You can run it through sequence production or...
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Phlow is it's a tool. It is, we'll use it where appropriate, but if it's not needed, we'll take a much more traditional approach to that.
And just a couple of comments. We're almost out of time, but I was going to make a couple of comments. So one of the things that was highlighted, can you have something that you can just pick off the shelf and run? And one of the things that we're seeing, the complexity of Phlow is, some of it is minimizing, but a lot of it's become more complex. So for example, the interface of chemists, of engineers, and now IT software developers and hardware developing of IT. That's something that's really moving into Phlow, where it's taking it out of the hands of just a chemist, and you need all these attributes. And especially if you're going to go to machine learning and have these systems be able to learn from themselves with the process analytical techniques that can be bringing into Phlow currently. And I think that's one big field that you'll see to really expand in the next few years. And then using that type of information with AI, and how that all is going to come together and drive where Phlow is going to be in the next few years is who knows, but since of all the advances that we're seeing already using AI, I really feel that flow chemistry is going to rise to a completely different level with the use of AI, so we can do that machine learning. But those ideas of having the engineer, the chemist, an IT person, someone that now understands AI, that complexity, whoever can pull these pieces together the quickest is going to be, I think, the real winners in the future in flow technologies. Any other comments for you, Simon, before we sign off?
No, I think we're probably out of time at this point, but really appreciate you all coming and listening. If you've got any questions for Joe and I, we'll be more than happy to address those either right now or as a follow-up conversation. And no, I think there's some interesting work going on. There's definitely some good processes here. Phlow is not a fit for everything, but it is another tool that we can all utilize, and we are here to help you do that.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Simon. And thank you all you for your attention.
Thank you.